Okay, so freedom. Everybody's talking about it, right? Feels like it dominates the news, social media, even family dinners. But are we even talking about the same thing anymore? You shared some excerpts from a conversation with the historian Timothy Snyder, author of On Freedom. And especially now, just weeks away from the election, his perspective really makes you think.
Yeah, for sure. Freedom has become such a loaded term, like a lot of political language these days. What I find really helpful is how Snyder unpacks this thing he calls the negative freedom trap. I think without realizing it, a lot of us get caught in that trap.
Okay, so break that down for us. What's the negative freedom trap, and how does it affect us, especially now with the election so close?
Well, it's this idea that freedom is mostly about what you're free from. Think about how often you hear stuff like freedom from government overreach or freedom from tyranny. I mean, obviously those are important things, right?
Yep.
But Snyder's point is that when we focus only on freedom from, our view of freedom gets really narrow.
So it's like we're so busy worrying about what we don't want, we forget to even ask. What do we actually want to be free to do?
Exactly. And that's where his whole concept of positive freedoms comes in. These aren't about some absence of something. They're about the actual conditions that are present, the things that let us thrive. Like, he uses examples, right? Things like freedom to walk the streets at night as a woman, or even freedom to raise your kids without being constantly terrified about how much childcare costs.
See, now those are examples that really hit home. Suddenly, freedom isn't some vague philosophical thing, it's about our actual lives.
Right? It becomes about how we actually move through the world, what we have the power to do. And this is where that warning from Snyder about authoritarianism really struck me. He says, the moment you think freedom comes from outside or the past, you're basically asking for authoritarianism.
Wow. That's
Think about it. How many times have we heard politicians promising to restore our freedoms, as if freedom is some lost object they can magically give back to us?
right. Like, just trust us, we'll handle freedom for you. Which, honestly, in this day and age, that can sound a bit, well, more than a bit unnerving.
Exactly. And that's the real danger of this negative freedom trap. When
Yeah.
we start seeing freedom as something that's granted to us instead of something we actively shape, it becomes way too easy for those in power to, well, manipulate and control us.
And that's what we've seen lately, haven't we? Certain groups, especially on the right, try to claim freedom as their own, often by shrinking it down to just mean whatever they happen to want at that moment.
Absolutely. Though Snyder makes an interesting point about that, too. He talks about how even people who strongly support figures like, say, Trump, even they seem to be moving away from using the word freedom.
Really? That's fascinating.
It is, isn't it? Almost as if they're realizing that true freedom, the kind that lets people grow, pursue their own meaning, that can't exist if you're busy using freedom as a weapon to wield against others.
It's like the whole idea of freedom has become so twisted up, so misused in our politics, that it's losing its power even for those who claim to hold it up as the sacred thing. So, how do we escape that trap? How do we get to a healthier, broader understanding of freedom? Snyder suggests we might need to rethink the role of government itself, which I think will surprise some people.
That's where he gets really challenging. Because that whole idea that government is always the opposite of freedom, that's so deeply ingrained for Americans. But what Snyder argues is government isn't the enemy of freedom. It can be a tool we use to create the conditions for more freedom.
Okay, so instead of always seeing the government as this big, scary thing taking away our freedom, what if we started thinking about it as a way to build a world where we're all more free to live meaningful lives?
Exactly. And Snyder gives some really concrete examples of what he means in this conversation.
Mm.
He talks about things like, having access to quality childcare, affordable education, a healthcare system that doesn't bankrupt you if you get sick. I
Mhm.
mean, those might sound like difficult political issues, but he's framing them as things that actually enable freedom.
Because when you think about it, those things have a huge impact on how free we really are in our day-to-day lives. It's like, how free are you to chase your dreams if you're constantly worried about paying rent, or if one unexpected medical bill could completely wipe you out?
Exactly. It's all about creating this foundation, right, of
Yeah.
security, of well-being, and that allows people, individuals, to actually thrive. Snyder's argument is when you have access to these things, it reduces worry, for one thing, but it also opens up possibilities. And ultimately, that lets you live a life that's more self-directed, more fulfilling.
So it's less about asking, am I free from government interference, and more about asking, what would I be free to do if certain things were guaranteed, if I didn't have these constant anxieties?
Hmm.
It's a completely different way of looking at it, and it opens up so many more possibilities.
Right. That's what I find so exciting about Snyder's view. He's not just pointing out what's broken, he's actually offering a different path forward, a way to build a society that makes well-being a priority, a society that expands how we even define what's possible.
And you mentioned earlier that Snyder is pretty optimistic about this, that America could actually embrace this more expansive idea of freedom. What makes him so hopeful?
He believes that as more people actually experience these positive freedoms, that's what he calls them, by the way, he thinks people will start to demand more of them. Like, imagine a whole generation that grows up with affordable childcare, good education, healthcare that isn't a constant source of stress. Do you think they'd be willing to accept a system that takes those things away?
It's like that saying, you don't know what you're missing until it's gone. Once people have tasted that kind of freedom, that ability to pursue their passions, because their basic needs are met, it's hard to imagine going back to a system that limits those possibilities.
Exactly. And that's where we come in,
Yeah.
all of us as individuals, because this shift in thinking, this move toward positive freedom, that doesn't just happen automatically. It takes action. It takes engagement. And it takes a willingness to challenge how things have always been done.
Okay, so let's talk about that. What does that look like in practice? What can people listening do, especially right now with the election so close, to help create this future that Snyder's talking about, this future where positive freedom is a reality?
That is the question, isn't it? It's easy to get caught up in the big ideas, but how do we actually make it happen? Especially with something as, well, immediate as an election.
Right, where do we even begin?
It can feel overwhelming for sure. Like the problems are so big, so systemic, you almost want to give up before you start. But Snyder, he makes this point about hope. He says, hope comes from action. It's easy to get stuck in that cycle of despair, especially during election season. But even small things, small acts of engagement, those can be surprisingly powerful.
It's like when you've got that totally messy room
Uh-huh.
and you just want to shut the door and pretend it doesn't exist, but then you force yourself to do one tiny thing like make the bed or clear off a corner of your desk, and suddenly it doesn't feel quite so impossible anymore.
Yes, exactly. That's the energy we need to bring to this whole conversation about freedom. It's not about having every single answer or thinking we can fix everything by ourselves. It's about those small steps, those meaningful actions we can take in our own lives, in our communities.
Okay, so let's get practical then. What are some concrete things people can do in these next few weeks before the election? Things that actually align with this vision of positive freedom?
Well, I mean, obviously voting is huge, but it's more than just showing up and casting your ballot. It's about being informed,
Mm.
really understanding the issues and doing your research on where the candidates stand. Things like affordable childcare, paid family leave, access to good schools. These are all concrete policy areas that have a direct impact on how freely people can live their lives.
So it's about connecting the dots between our values and our actions, because it's easy to get swept up in all the political talk, all the slogans, but when it comes down to it, we're choosing leaders. Leaders and policies that will create the kind of world we actually have to live in.
100%. And those actions, they don't stop at the voting booth either. Think about the conversations you have with friends, with family. Are you promoting understanding,
Yeah.
empathy? Do you challenge those negative freedom narratives when you hear them? Because even those small acts of, well, honestly, sometimes it takes courage, but those acts can really make a difference.
It's like planting seeds. You might not see anything sprout up right away, but those conversations, those moments where you question things, challenge the status quo, those have a way of rippling outward.
Exactly. And don't forget about community involvement, too. Supporting organizations doing the work on the ground, fighting for social justice, economic equality, environmental sustainability. Those are all ways to create a more just world, a more equitable world. And ultimately, that means more freedom for everyone.
Because in the end, our own freedom is connected to everyone else's.
Yeah.
It's not a zero-sum game.
Right. We're all in this together. And that's what I find so powerful about Snyder's vision of positive freedom. It's not about me first, It's not about individual liberty at the expense of others. It's about building a society where everybody has the opportunity to thrive.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, there's this question Snyder asks towards the end of the conversation. He says, America has a chance right now to turn the corner, to move away from this limited idea of freedom and towards a future that's really about well-being, about individual flourishing.
Yeah, that's a powerful image. Like we're at this crossroads and we have to choose which way to go.
And that choice, it starts with each of us individually. It starts with asking ourselves, what kind of world do I want to live in? What does true freedom really mean to me? And most importantly, what am I willing to do to actually make that happen?
Those are the questions we need to sit with. Carry them with you as we head into these next few weeks. Let them guide your actions, your conversations, and, yeah, your vote.
Because this idea of freedom, its future, really does depend on the choices we're making right now.